There's a small four-sided clay prism sitting behind glass in a museum in Oxford, covered in tiny cuneiform wedges pressed into wet clay almost 4,000 years ago. And if you read it carefully, in order, exactly the way it was meant to be read, it tells you that the very first king to rule on Earth reigned for 28,800 years. Not 28 years, not 280, 28,800 years on a single throne in a single city before handing power to a successor who reigned for even longer. Keep reading, and the numbers only get worse. City after city, king after king, reign stretching 30,000 years, 36,000 years, one king credited with an almost incomprehensible 43,200 years on the throne, until you hit a single line, buried partway through the list, that changes everything without any warning at all. Just 5 words, more or less. Then the flood swept over. And after that line, the numbers don't just shrink, they collapse, dropping almost instantly from tens of thousands of years down into hundreds, then eventually down into ranges that actually look like something a real human being could have lived through. This document is real. It's called the Sumerian King List, and it has been quietly unsettling historians, archaeologists, and theologians for over a century, not because it's obviously fake and not because it's obviously true, but because it sits in this deeply uncomfortable space in between, a text that appears to blend genuine, verifiable political history with something that reads disturbingly close to a memory of a catastrophe so old and so severe that it fractured the entire timeline of civilization itself into 2 distinct eras, before and after. The Sumerian King List wasn't discovered in some dramatic tomb-raiding expedition. It emerged gradually through the patient, unglamorous work of archaeologists and Assyriologists, excavating and translating cuneiform tablets recovered from multiple sites across ancient Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The most complete and most famous surviving copy is a small prism-shaped clay artifact now known as the Weld Blundell Prism, acquired by Oxford's Ashmolean Museum in 1922, inscribed on all 4 sides in a compact, dense column of cuneiform script. But it isn't a single, isolated document. Fragments and partial copies of essentially the same king list with overlapping names, overlapping reign lengths, and the same fundamental structure have turned up at multiple separate archaeological sites, copied by different scribes at different points in history, which tells researchers something important right away. This wasn't a one-off curiosity written by a single eccentric priest. It was a text that got copied, recopied, and actively maintained across generations of Sumerian and later Babylonian scribes, treated by the people who kept producing new versions of it as something worth preserving and updating, essentially, as an official historical record. And that's really what it claims to be. The Sumerian King List presents itself as a straightforward sequential account of kingship in ancient Mesopotamia, structured city by city, dynasty by dynasty, opening with the declaration that kingship itself was, in the words of the text, lowered from heaven, and that it first descended upon the city of Eridu, generally considered by archaeologists today to be among the oldest cities in the entire region, with occupation layers dating back roughly to 5400 BC. From there, the list proceeds methodically. Eridu's kings rule for an almost incomprehensible span of time. Then kingship passes to another city, Bad Tabira, whose kings rule for their own vast stretch. Then it passes again and again, moving between a small handful of ancient Sumerian cities, each one credited, in turn, with holding the seat of kingship over the rest, each one listing its kings by name and, crucially, by the exact number of years they supposedly reigned. And it's those numbers that make this document so genuinely strange to sit with. The 8 kings the list credits with ruling before the Great Flood arrives in the narrative have a combined total reign length of somewhere around 241,000 years. To be clear, that's not 241,000 years of combined history across an entire civilization. That's 8 individual human beings, according to the text, collectively occupying roughly 250,000 years of rule between them. One king, Alulim of Eridu, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years on his own. Another, Enmenlu Ana of Bad Tabira, is credited with an even longer 43,200 years. These aren't rounding errors or scribal typos either. The numbers follow a consistent internal logic, built around the ancient Mesopotamian sexagesimal number system, a base 60 counting method that, strange as it sounds today, is actually the same underlying system that still gives us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. The specific reign lengths assigned to these antediluvian kings are, almost without exception, clean multiples of that sexagesimal system, which strongly suggests they weren't meant to be read as literal historical record-keeping, the way you'd log a modern king's actual birth and death dates. They read more like something deliberately, mathematically constructed. Then comes the line that turns this entire document into something else entirely. After finishing the account of the 8th antediluvian king, the text states, directly and without elaboration, that the flood then swept over the land, and that after the flood had subsided, kingship was once again lowered from heaven, this time to the city of Kish. And from that point forward in the text, everything changes. The reign lengths, while still wildly exaggerated by any realistic human standard, drop dramatically, from tens of thousands of years down into the hundreds, with early post-flood kings credited with reigns like 600 years or 900 years, still not remotely plausible for an actual human lifespan, but a completely different order of magnitude from what came before. And as the list continues, moving through dynasty after dynasty, city after city, that trend continues, with reign lengths gradually, steadily shrinking generation by generation, decade by decade, edging closer and closer toward numbers that actually resemble something a real historical human ruler could have plausibly lived through. Until, by the time the list reaches later, well-documented Mesopotamian dynasties, the reign lengths it assigns line up reasonably closely with what archaeologists and historians already know from independent evidence, inscriptions, contracts, and administrative records recovered directly from the sites those later kings actually ruled. And this is where the Sumerian King List stops being a curiosity and starts being genuinely deeply unsettling, because it doesn't stay comfortably fictional the whole way through. Several of the kings named later in the list are independently, verifiably real, confirmed through completely separate archaeological evidence that has nothing to do with the king list itself. In Mesopotamia of Kish, a ruler the list credits with a still exaggerated but far more modest reign of 900 years, is attested through his own contemporary inscriptions, physical objects bearing his actual name, discovered in real excavations, dating to a real specific period in Mesopotamian history, roughly the 26th century BC. That confirmation matters enormously, because it means the Sumerian King List isn't simply a work of pure mythology dressed up as history. Somewhere inside this document, real kings who genuinely existed, who genuinely ruled real cities in a real, datable period of ancient history, are woven directly into the exact same continuous, unbroken narrative structure as kings credited with tens of thousands of years on the throne. The text doesn't mark a clear boundary and tell you, here is where myth ends and verified history begins. It just keeps going, king after king, reign after reign, treating the entire span, from a ruler with a 28,000-year reign to a ruler independently confirmed by a physical inscription found in the ground, as one single, unbroken, continuous account of legitimate kingship. So why would ancient scribes build a historical record this way, deliberately blending numbers that read as mythological with figures they clearly understood to be real, documented, recent political history? The leading academic explanation isn't nearly as simple as either fully believe it or fully dismiss it, and it's worth sitting with, because it reveals something almost more unsettling than the flood story itself. Most Assyriologists today believe the Sumerian King List functioned primarily as a political and propagandistic tool, composed and repeatedly revised, most likely around the time of the third dynasty of Ur, roughly 2000 BC, specifically to serve the interests of whichever dynasty happened to be commissioning or maintaining the latest copy. Ancient Mesopotamia, in physical reality, on the ground, was never a single unified kingdom passing power neatly from one city to the next in an orderly, sequential line. It was a shifting, often overlapping patchwork of competing, independent city-states frequently ruling simultaneously, frequently at war with one another, frequently negotiating and renegotiating, who actually held real regional power at any given moment. The Sumerian King List erases almost all of that inconvenient, messy, simultaneous reality and replaces it with something much cleaner and far more useful to whoever was in charge when a given copy was produced, a single, continuous, divinely sanctioned line of legitimate kingship, passed neatly from one city to the next, implying that ultimate authority over the entire region had always rested with exactly one ruling city at a time, and, conveniently, that it now rested with whichever dynasty happened to be commissioning that particular copy of the list. That's the genuinely chilling part once you actually sit with it. This isn't simply an ancient culture accidentally exaggerating the age of the world through primitive record-keeping, or an early culture's naive relationship with big numbers. Increasingly, it looks like something closer to one of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of intentional historical engineering that survives anywhere in the archaeological record. A document specifically constructed to rewrite a genuinely chaotic, competitive, multi-city political reality into a tidy, singular narrative of destiny and legitimate succession, complete with a symbolic act of divine judgment. The flood, deliberately inserted at exactly the point in the story where it conveniently allows the narrative to reset, discard whatever inconvenient earlier claims to power existed, and begin building legitimacy again from scratch. If a government today rewrote its own founding history to erase every rival claim to power and replace it with one clean, uninterrupted line leading directly to itself, we would immediately correctly call that propaganda. The unsettling realization here is that people were already doing exactly that, with this exact level of narrative sophistication, roughly 4,000 years ago, and doing it well enough that it took modern archaeology the better part of a century to even begin fully untangling fact from construction inside it. But the flood itself, the single narrative hinge the entire document pivots around, deserves its own close look, because it's far from an isolated claim confined to this one artifact, and that's precisely what makes it so difficult to simply wave away as pure invention. A broadly similar flood narrative appears independently in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature on Earth, where a man named Utnapishtim describes being warned in advance of a coming deluge, building a massive boat, loading it with his family and animals, and surviving a flood so severe it wiped out the rest of humanity. A story bearing an unmistakable structural resemblance to the biblical account of Noah found later in the book of Genesis. And it doesn't stop there. A Babylonian priest and historian named Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, centuries after the original Sumerian King List was composed, and drawing on Babylonian temple records that no longer survive independently today, produced his own account of ancient Mesopotamian history that includes an almost identical structure, a list of extraordinarily long reigning kings before a great flood, followed by a dramatic drop in reign lengths afterward. Berossus had no access to the specific cuneiform tablets modern archaeologists would eventually excavate and translate nearly 2,000 years later. He was working from an entirely separate line of preserved tradition, and yet his account lines up with the core structure of the Sumerian King List closely enough that it strongly suggests both were drawing on a genuinely old, genuinely widespread, independently transmitted cultural memory, not simply one scribe's isolated invention that happened to get lucky. And underneath all of that layered political and literary complexity sits a real, physical, geological question that archaeology has actually been able to test directly in the ground, and the results are stranger than you might expect. In the 1920s, the pioneering British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating at the ancient city of Ur, dug down through the site's accumulated layers of occupation and, at a certain specific depth, hit a thick, distinct layer of water-deposited silt, roughly 8 feet of clean, flood-laid clay, sitting directly between 2 separate layers of clear human occupation and material culture. Essentially, a physical geological marker of a real, severe, regionally significant flooding event, sandwiched inside the archaeological record at exactly the depth corresponding to the very early history of Sumerian civilization. Woolley, perhaps a little too eagerly at the time, declared it definitive physical proof of the biblical flood itself. Modern archaeologists and geologists are considerably more cautious about that specific conclusion, and rightly so, since similar flood deposit layers found at other Mesopotamian sites don't all line up neatly to the same date, strongly suggesting the region experienced multiple large, locally catastrophic river floods over the centuries, rather than one single globally synchronized event. But the more measured, more genuinely unsettling takeaway isn't that ancient Mesopotamia experienced one specific flood, exactly matching the biblical or Sumerian account. It's that this was a landscape defined, generation after generation, by real, severe, life-altering flooding, catastrophic enough and remembered vividly enough that it left a permanent structural fracture point in how an entire civilization chose to organize and tell its own history, a before and an after, carved as deeply into their collective cultural memory as it was carved into the actual physical layers of silt still sitting in the ground beneath Ur today. Which brings us back to why this strange, dense little clay prism deserves to be called one of the most genuinely unsettling documents in the entire historical record. And it isn't really about the impossible numbers themselves, even though those numbers are certainly the detail that grabs your attention first. It's about what those numbers, and the deliberate, careful narrative structure wrapped around them, actually reveal about how fragile, how manufactured, and how quietly manipulable the entire concept of recorded history can be. Even in civilizations we consider foundational to the entire idea of written record-keeping in the first place. The Sumerian King List blends verified, physically confirmed historical rulers, with kings credited with reigns lasting longer than recorded human civilization itself has even existed, stitches them together into one single unbroken narrative with no internal marker, distinguishing myth from fact, uses a real remembered catastrophe as a deliberate narrative hinge to reset and legitimize political power, and then gets copied, revised, and actively maintained as an official record for centuries afterward, treated with total apparent sincerity by scribe after scribe, dynasty after dynasty. If a civilization this early, this foundational to human writing and record-keeping itself, was already capable of blending real history with mythologized legitimacy this seamlessly, and getting away with it convincingly enough to fool serious scholars for the better part of a century, it raises an uncomfortable question that extends well beyond one clay prism sitting in a museum case in Oxford. How much of what any civilization in any era, including our own, chooses to preserve as official history is actually an honest record of what happened? And how much of it is a story, carefully constructed, strategically edited, and quietly agreed upon by whoever happened to be holding power at the moment it was finally written down?